Hoya, you chante washte na pechu zapalo. Some of you probably understand that, and I'm guessing most of you don't. It's a formal greeting that our people use anytime they speak to a group of people, and it's an opening and it's also a closing. And there are two translations for it. One is literal. Literally, it means with a good heart I shake your hand. Colloquially, it means I take your hand in friendship. So you take your pick, whichever one of those that you like. But thank you for coming. I'm glad to be here. I appreciate the invitation, and I'll try to live up to the expectations. As Whitney indicated, I grew up on the Rosebud Reservation, and my first language is Lakota, not English. I started school when I was 8 years old. Imagine being 8 and being the tallest kid in kindergarten and not being able to carry on a conversation in English. In fact, my brothers-in-law still say I don't know how to speak English. But in growing up that way, I had access to not just my grandparents, my maternal grandparents. I also had a relationship with my other grandparents as well. But I also had access to people who were their age, their generation, people who were 60, 70, 80 years old and older. And all of them were Lakota speakers, all of them. Some of them knew how to speak English, but chose not to. But anytime there was a family gathering or get together, any kind of occasion, people were kind of visiting, everything was done in Lakota. All the stories were told in Lakota. Everybody visited in Lakota. So that's how I grew up. So, I grew up inculcated with the language, and it wasn't until I was 8 years old I began to learn English. I knew a few words in English, but I couldn't carry on a conversation at all. So learning English was a very stressful process for me. It took me about 4 years to reach a point where I was comfortable carrying on conversation, to be idiomatic, as you say. And it was so stressful that I developed a stutter in English. So you may hear me stutter now and then throughout the evening. But the interesting thing is I don't stutter in Lakota. So you figure that one out. When I was a boy, as I said, I heard a lot of stories. And one of the things I heard consistently was stories about a person named Kashunka Witko. And literally translated means his crazy horse. We all know him as just Crazy Horse. But the real translation of his name is His Crazy Horse. And I listened to people tell stories about him. Not stories about his whole life, but little vignettes of something he did or something he said, something he was part of. And over time, then all of those little vignettes and stories amounted to one large sort of biography. So, if you will, my research into Crazy Horse started when I was probably 5 years old, when I began to listen to those stories. And as any boy is, I was fascinated with Crazy Horse as a warrior, as a fighting man, as a guy who could shoot a bow and arrow and ride a horse, all those things that boys are really attracted to and fond of. But as I grew older, I found out that he was held very dear and respected, even among my grandparents' generation, not because he was a warrior, but because he was a good man. And over the years, as I learned more stories about him, then he became a real person to me, because he is not a mythological figure. He might have reached mythological proportions in our minds because of some of the things he did, but he was an ordinary person just like you and me. So I thought that this would be a good time, since we're here at this place, since you are part of a program that is here, that it would be appropriate for me to talk about Crazy Horse. So that's what we're going to do. So bear with me. We'll do a short biography. It's only 150 slides long. I'm just kidding. So here we go. It's my guess that by 1492, certainly around there somewhere, we hear that there were several hundred native nations in North America. By that I mean Canada, what is now Canada, what is now the United States, what is now Mexico and Central America. But I submit as a historian that there were probably more than that. There were probably upwards of 1,000 or two different nations, each with a separate language, if you can imagine that, each with separate territories. And all of those nations, over the centuries, over the millennia, had their share of leaders. And, you know, when you study history starting from the East Coast and working your way west about indigenous history, you hear names like Pontiac and those kinds of names that were leaders worthy of note. And we had our own. As Lakota people, we had our own leaders. And a lot of them, many, many of them. Most of them we don't hear about, but they were there. Each generation had its own set of leaders. And for us, the two most well-known are Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull. You can go anywhere in this country and say those two names and somebody will have some amount of recognition. Oh yeah, I heard that name before. And they'll try to tell you something about what they know. But Crazy Horse was certainly one of those that you say his name and people automatically know. So I'm going to do just a very short biographical case study. And maybe some of you know about Crazy Horse already, and my apologies if I'm telling you something you already know. But I think some of us don't. So it would behoove us, I think, to gain a little bit more insight if you don't mind. We have to talk about who he was and what made him what he was. And that's really what this presentation is all about. So who is Crazy Horse? We don't know what he looks like because there are no photographs of him. People claim that he had his photograph taken, but he did not. That's what I believe, for a lot of reasons that I'll talk about later. He certainly doesn't look like the mountain. I'll say that much. The physical descriptions I have heard over the years was that he was fairly tall, maybe around 6 feet, slender. His hair was obviously long. It was dark brown to light brown in summertime. And he had very dark eyes, a thin, narrow face, a long nose, and a wide mouth, and very intense gaze. That's the physical description that kept coming around. And it's the most consistent one that I've ever heard. He did not have gray eyes, contrary to what some historians and novelists say. And some even go to the point of suggesting he was part Washichu, but that's not the case at all. He was not even close. Oops. So we have to understand where he came from. And as I said, nobody knows what he looks like. So this is my depiction looking from behind him. Because people had that view of him, because they were always following him. And he liked to wear a red stone tied to his left ear. So this depicts that. So who he was is very much rooted in where he came from, his family and his community. And as a Lakota person, like some of you are, like I am, we know that there are 7 Lakota groups, or some people say subgroups, but the Lakota is one overall nation. We call ourselves the Buffalo people, or the Pteta Oyate, people of the Buffalo. That's us, the Lakota. And these are the 7 groups. Oglala, Sicangu, Hunkpapa, Manikanju, Itazapachola, Ohe, Nupe, and Sihasapa. Try saying that really fast. Those are the 7 groups, and those are the names in Lakota. And each of those names has a separate meaning. Oglala means probably to scatter, to go all over. Hunkpapa, or Sicangu is burnt thigh, or burnt leg. Hunkpapa is those who camp at the end. And you can see each of those has a different name. Manikanju is the plant by the water. Itaza Pachola is literally without bows. Ohenupe is two kettles or two boilings, or to boil twice. In Sihasapa is black souls. Not black feet, black souls. Sihasapa is the bottom of your feet. So each one of those names, if we had more time, we'd go into the names for the reasons for these names, but each one of these names has a reason that they exist. And people who are Hunkpapa or Galala will be glad to tell you how those names came about. But these are the 7 groups. And Crazy Horse was 2 of those, believe it or not. Some of you may be more than one group. My father's Oglala and my mother's Sicangu. But because my mother is from Rosebud, we were enrolled at Rosebud. So we're officially listed as Sicangu Lakota, but my siblings are also Oglala. This is a map that I want you to take a special note of. If you look at the center of it, the yellow section where it says plains, North America is divided into anywhere from about 12 what are called cultural groups, cultural areas. And they're distinguished by topography, geography, weather patterns, plants, animals. Something is unique and different about each one of those groups, each one of these areas. And as you can see, the plains area is one of the larger ones. The largest one is subarctic. From the north, it's Arctic, subarctic, and so forth. And the people who lived in each of these areas had their own distinct lifestyle. So the idea or the saying that an Indian is an Indian is an Indian, or that all native cultures are alike, is simply not true. Because we all had different lifestyles. The people who lived in the east, in our northeast and southeast woodlands, were sedentary. You know what that means, right? Sedentary means to stay in one place. They have a permanent location. Their villages were permanent. That doesn't mean they didn't go off to hunt and so forth, but their villages were permanent. Why? Not because that's what they decided, but because the forest was so thick that movement was really hard. To travel over long distances in big groups, the forest made it hard. So they just stayed in one place. Whereas the people of the plains, you know what it's like around here. It's wide open country. You get to the top of one hill, then you got to see what's over the top of the next hill. And more than that, as we'll talk about later, the bison were migratory animals. And we lived on the bison. We hunted them. We used them. So in order for us to survive, we had to follow the bison. We had to move. So therefore, the people of the plains were nomads, meaning we moved. We relocated our villages depending on the season, depending on the need, and so forth. So those are the 2 basic lifestyles of anybody who lived in these areas. And people in the northwest coast and the northeast coast, those guys went out, made big boats, went out on the ocean, hunted whales. We hunted buffalo from the back of a horse, but they hunted whales. So as indigenous people, we're all different. That's the whole point of this particular discussion. And narrowing it down, I'm sure some of you have seen this map on Facebook. It appears there every now and then. And it shows, in comparison to the current states, what our territory was at one time, from what is now most of Minnesota all the way west to what are now Montana and Wyoming. And then you notice South Dakota is right square in the middle. So our territory, it didn't have static borders. It didn't have lines of demarcation. But we know where our territory is. It ended with a mountain range or a river or something. That was a natural barrier or natural marker. But our territory at one time, probably up until the mid-1800s, was larger than most European countries at the time. So this was our territory. This is the territory of the Nakota, the Dakota, and West the Lakota, our people. And this is where Crazy Horse came from. So let's talk about his family a bit. Crazy Horse's father was named Crazy Horse. And he was the second person in that family to have that name. So the crazy horse that we're talking about tonight was the third person to have that name. So we don't know the reason or the origin of the name, what happened so that the first crazy horse earned the name. We don't know for sure. But so it was the grandfather, the son, and now the crazy horse that we all know was the third person to have that name. He was Oglala Lakota. The second crazy horse was Oglala Lakota, and he was a medicine man. He was a healer, traditional healer. And he was, like I said, second in the family to have that name. And at some point, when Crazy Horse was like 16 or 17 and he earned the right to an adult name, then his father gave him the name Crazy Horse. And he took the name of Worm for himself, indicating that he was a very humble person. Being a worm is about as humble as you can get. So he decided that was the name for him. His mother was Shinayu Kakawi, or Rattling Blanket Woman. She was Munikanju. So Crazy Horse was Oglala and Munikanju. So he was two of the 7 bands. And he had an older sister. And he certainly had a younger brother. And I think later on he had a younger sister named Iron Cedar. But his mother died. His birth mother died when he was about 4 years old. Probably as a result of suicide. Some of the stories suggest that. She might have committed suicide. We don't know why exactly. There are stories that suggest why, but all we know for sure is it's probably suicide. So those who his parents were: Crazy Horse, who was later Worm, and then his mother is Rattling Blanket Woman. And of course, this is nothing new to some of you. You know what it looks like around here. Just miles and miles, nothing but miles and miles, which is really cool as far as I'm concerned. Just another view. Looks like home to me. I don't know about some of you. And of course, the Black Hills. And why am I showing you these? Because these are all part of what Crazy Horse was. It wasn't just his family and his community. It was where he grew up that impacted who he was. I mean, I've been all over the world, but I don't feel very comfortable in forests. They're sort of I feel like I'm being crowded in a forest. But when I see a wide open space, then I'm okay. Because I grew up here. I was born here and I grew up here. And my spirit and my soul is used to that. So where you were born, where you grew up, it has something to do with who you are as an individual. As I said, we were hunters. But you didn't know we used dogs to hunt. We did. This is a real interesting sketch of a hunter. And this is a glimpse into what villages might have looked like in that time. Every village had more horses than people. So there were always horses around. Every family had like 3 different categories of horses. One just for basic transportation. Everybody had a riding horse, more or less. Horses that were used to transport goods, the teepee and the belongings. And then the males of the family, usually the father, had 3 kinds of horses. One to ride, one to go to war in, and one to hunt buffalo with. So when you know that, then you understand why every family had a lot of horses. So it was not unusual. It was probably the rule for a village of, say, 200 to have like 800 or 900 horses. This is pretty cool, as far as I'm concerned. And of course, here we go. This was our livelihood. And the estimates were that there were millions and millions of these animals on the plains. Who knows how many? Some people estimate from 30 to 60 million. That's a lot of animals. Interesting painting here. See the 2 characters in the foreground? Crawling. These 2 hunters under a wolf hide cape. That was one way to hunt buffalo. Arrows in one hand, bow in another. And buffalo were not afraid of 1 or 2 or 3 wolves. So they just hardly paid attention to them. So that enabled hunters wearing wolf hides to crawl in really close within, imagine, 20, 30 yards from the length of one end of this room to the other, or closer, close enough to get an arrow or two into the animal. Can you imagine hunting like that? When I was a boy, a neighboring rancher had 4 or 5 head of buffalo in his pasture, and he had a really high fence, and I must have been like 6 years old. I was always curious about them. So one day I walked to the fence and I waited and waited, and lo and behold, here they come. So I crawled close up to a bush, and they walked right by me like 6 feet away. And those things, I'm telling you, were humongous. And my heart was pounding almost out of my chest. They were so close. And because I was afraid, they would see me, which of course they didn't. But I can imagine what these guys felt like, crawling in among a herd of giants. Oops. And this is another way to hunt buffalo, which is a little bit more exciting. Buffalo can run upwards of 30 miles an hour. They cannot run a horse. Horses know that. So buffalo horses had to be specially trained to chase buffalo, to get over their fear of the buffalo. And there's a whole nother story about how to train buffalo horses. But can you imagine doing this? Going pell-mell 35, 40 miles an hour down a hill and with a bow and arrow in your hand. The only thing wrong with this sketch is that the hunter is on the wrong side. He's right-handed. He's shooting his bow with his right hand. He should be on the other side of the animal. Makes sense, doesn't it? If you're right-handed, to be on the right side of the animal. So if you're a left-handed archer like I am, you'd be on the left side. Other than that, this is a cool sketch. I learned to shoot a bow from a running horse. It isn't easy. I can't tell you how many times I fell. I don't do it anymore because I'm not as flexible as I used to be. I don't bounce as high anymore. But it was fun. It was interesting. So here's a boy, like Crazy Horse probably did, following his dad on a hunt, or some adult male on a hunt, to teach him how to be a hunter. And not just Crazy Horse, but a lot of boys grew up learning this. It reminds me of going to hunt with my grandfather. That's what he taught me. So when he was a kid, his mom called him Gigi. And a lot of biographies they say his name was Curly. No, his name was Gigi, which means light hair. Because he had light hair, which was unusual. Every other kid probably had really, really cold black hair. And his mom knew that other kids would tease him about it, so she just gave him the name Gigi, so he would know what it was. So that was his boyhood name growing up. And he also had very light skin. And that's where some people say, well, that's because he was part white. That's not the case. There is a physiological condition that's like 2 or 3 steps down from albinism. You know what an albino is? Albino animal, albino person, where they have really white skin. Their eyes are light and their hair is light as well. Well, there's a condition that's like 3 steps down where a person's skin is really light, and it shows up in darker skinned races. And I imagine this is what the case was with Crazy Horse, because his hair was light as well. So he was teased for all of that, for having lighter hair. You know how some kids are. And of course, as I said earlier, his mother died when he was 4. And his father remarried 2 sisters, who was Sicangu. So although his birth mother died, his second mothers, as he liked to call them, he didn't call them, in our culture, there's no concept of stepmother. Either your mom was your mom, your brother and sister were your brother and sister, not stepsisters or half-sisters. They were your sister, your brother, your mother, your father. That's how we are. That's our cultural outlook on it. So he married 2 sisters, and they had more influence on his upbringing than his birth mother did. So, in a sense, that was probably a good thing. And then eventually later, he had a younger brother. His name was Little Hawk. And if you can imagine, we talk about Crazy Horse being a daring, reckless warrior. When Little Hawk came of age, he was even more reckless and even more daring than Crazy Horse was. But he died young. He was killed. And about that time, because of the teasing, because he was basically a very shy person, withdrawn. He became a loner. He spent a lot of time by himself. He would go off by himself to hunt, or just go somewhere and spend time alone. And he had a teacher. And this was not unusual. That was the educational system where adults taught the kids. The first teachers of kids were the moms and the grandmas and the aunties in the home. For the first 4, 5, 6 years, boys and girls were taught by the moms and the grandmas and the aunties. And then after that, the boys were turned over to their dads and their uncles and their grandfathers and other mentors that taught them these things. Girls were taught the things necessary to be a good woman, to be a good mom, to be a good nurturer, to learn how to keep a family together. Boys were taught these skills. So that's what Crazy Horse went through, Lighthearer went through as a boy. He was taught about weaponry. He was taught how to track, how to survive by himself on what we now call the wilderness, and how to ride a horse. He was probably given a horse when he was 5 years old, as most kids were, as most boys were. And girls too. Girls were taught to ride horses. And then growing up throughout his formative years, he learned the philosophy of the hunter and the warrior. So this is what the educative process that Crazy Horse went through as a boy. And these were very important things in his life that affected his attitude later on. He saw that people on the Oregon Trail, you probably studied the Oregon Trail, if you haven't, you will. From the mid-1840s to the 1860s, there was a trail from Missouri all the way to Oregon where white people just came through all the native lands, especially Lakota territory, in wagon trains pulled by oxen and donkeys and so forth, or mules and so forth. Thousands and thousands of them every summer for 20 years. Over the years, 350,000 people or thereabouts white people travel along the Oregon Trail. And when he was a young boy of 11 or 12, Crazy Horse went with his teacher, and they would sit and would watch these wagon trains. And I'm sure he wondered, well, where do these people come from? No, who the heck are they? Where are they going? What are they doing? Why don't they look like us? So he was curious, and that impacted his thinking. And then in 1851, there was a big treaty gathering at Fort Laramie in Wyoming. If you don't know what it is, it's in southeast central Wyoming. The fort there was the site of a lot of important events. 1851, Crazy Horse was only like 11 or 12, but he was there. You can imagine thousands of people from about 8 or 9 different tribes. Some of them didn't even speak the same language. But he was there watching what was going on, sort of absorbing it all and getting a sense of all these people who were part of his world. So he saw that. And then 3 years later, there was an incident over a cow. I'm sure you've heard the story where a cow wandered into a Sicangu village where Crazy Horse was visiting. And it raised all kinds of heck. It was knocking meat racks over and being a general nuisance. So somebody killed it and butchered the cow and gave the meat to the old people. And the guy who owned the cow, who happened to be a Mormon, wanted his cow back. Of course, you couldn't give him the cow back. It was dead. People were already eating it. So the head man of the village, a man named Conquering Bear, said, well, I'll give you 5 mules. And the guy said, no, I want my cow back. Well, how about 5 mules and 5 horses? Man, that's a heck of a deal for one skinny old, almost dead cow. But the guy refused. He wanted his cow back. So that's what started the whole thing. The guy went to the fort, complaining to the army. The army sent a contingent of soldiers to either arrest the guy who killed the cow or get the cow back. It didn't turn out well. The soldiers attacked, and all but one of them were killed. And some Lakota people were killed and wounded as well. The head man of the village was killed. Crazy Horse was there, and he saw that as a boy. He was then like 13 years old. He saw that. And he never forgot these kind of things. And then a year later, something even worse happened. In retaliation for the Grattan attack, the army sent out a general named Harney to punish those bad Indians who killed those soldiers. And this happened in western Nebraska. Well, this column of soldiers found this Indian encampment. That Little Thunder's encampment had nothing to do with the former encounter incident at all. But an Indian is an Indian is an Indian, right? So they surrounded the village. To make a long story short, they surrounded the village, and they invited the leaders. The general invited the leaders to talk at one place while the rest of the soldiers attacked the village and killed women and children and old people and captured a whole bunch of people and took them to Fort Laramie. Well, a lot of really horrible things happened. I mean, I can't begin to describe to you what happened. You'll have to use your imaginations. It was bad, it was ugly, it was sickening. Crazy Horse and some of it, when he was still curly, had been out hunting. And they came back to burned out villages and nothing but dead bodies. And he saw women and children being hauled away by the army. So he went into the village and all he saw was dead bodies, mutilated bodies. So when you see something like that, it's going to affect you for the rest of your life. It's going to shape how you think about whoever did that. So Crazy Horse's attitude toward white people, toward white folks, was shaped by those two incidents. The Grattan incident over the cow, and then a year later, the Ash Hollow massacre. So that was always at the core of his thinking. And other things that influenced him was, of course, his medicine man father. He was taught by his father the spiritual and philosophies, the spiritual beliefs, the philosophies, and so forth, like a lot of other boys and children were. And he also, through his mothers, they taught him, a lot of how women thought, how women should be treated, what the role of women were. And Crazy Horse was always respectful of everybody. Anybody who was older than him, he was respectful of them. And he admired the leaders of the day, whoever they were. He looked up to them because they influenced him, and he respected them. And also all the elders in the community. He was a very respectful young man and treated everybody with respect, especially the elders and the women. After the Grattan incident, what he saw, and he saw the leader, the headman of the village, mortally wounded and taken into his lodge. He was confused, probably scared, because he was just a teenager, 13 years old. So he hopped on his horse and just rode out of the village. And he rode a long way, probably miles and miles. And he didn't have anything with him, just a knife and maybe a water flask. That's all he had. He was out there by himself, trying to figure things out, as sometimes we do. And he spent a couple nights by himself, out alone. And then the second night, probably he had a dream, not a vision, but a night dream, because he hadn't had water for that whole time. He didn't have any food, so his physically he was in a weakened condition. So when you're in that kind of a state, then you have all kinds of weird dreams. And he had a weird dream. Some people call it weird. And people talk about that dream as his vision. And like I said, it wasn't a vision. He didn't go up on a hill for a vision quest and pray and receive a vision. He just had a dream. Like sometimes we have a night dream. That's what it was. But here was his dream. He told about his dream to his dad about a year later. Before that, he just kept it to himself. But here's what he told his dad. In his dream, he saw a lake, a long lake. And he was standing there facing the lake. And behind the lake were a row of mountains and clouds coming up over the mountains. And there was a red-tailed hawk flying over the lake. So if you can visualize all that, very placid scene, right? And all of a sudden, out of the water, out of the lake, comes a man on a horse. And he's riding on top of the water, galloping on the water across this lake. It's a dream, right? First the horse is black, and then it's red, and then it's yellow, and then it's white. and it keeps changing colors that way. And the hawk is flying above him. And then he rides all the way across the top of that lake until he gets to dry land. And as he gets to dry land, then people form out of the dry land. People who look like the rider, who had long hair and dark skin, and they surround the horse and the rider, and they pull the rider down from his horse. That was his dream. But as I said, he didn't tell his dad until about a year later. So his dad thought it was important enough for him to have it, to take it to other medicine men, to have a ceremony and to see what the dream meant. And we'll talk about what that dream meant later on. It's important to remember that dream. So in growing up, this is how he was influenced, and as all children and all boys were. The influence first started with his family. His father, his uncles, his mom, and then his second mothers, and all the members of the extended family, the Tioshpai, as we say. And then after that, it was everybody else in the village. And then the whole band. And what we believed, how we lived, what our philosophies were, what our spiritual values were. All of those things he learned, as every kid did, every young person did, male or female. And of course, then you owe your allegiance to the nation that enables all of that. So this was a circle of influence. It started with his family, went to his extended family, the community, to the band, and then to the nation. So this is really what made Curly into Crazy Horse and made him into what kind of a person he was later on. And as I said, he was very quiet and he was shy. He was not a good conversationalist. He would just say yes or no or whatever. And I was always walking around with his head down because he didn't, he was that kind of a person. And he was especially respectful of elders, to the point where he would hunt for them a lot, and the widows. He would go out to hunt, and he would bring game home, whether it was a deer, an elk, a rabbit, or whatever, and he would take it to the widows and the old people who didn't have hunters in their lodge. This is what he did. Later on, he taught his younger brother to do the same thing. So he was a very compassionate, very caring kind of person. So that influence in growing up this way and being the student of both males and females also taught him how to be a good defender. Family was important to him most of all. And everybody in the village was important to him. So he did everything. So that turned him into a badass warrior. You didn't want to mess with him. He was as I say, he was very quiet and shy on one hand, but once he got onto the battlefield, he changed into something else. He was very reckless, and because of his vision, and we'll talk more about that later. So he's a good person, he's a very respectful young man, and a really, really skilled warrior. He could fight from the back of a horse, or he could fight from foot, and that wasn't unusual. He wasn't the only one. There are other guys, every other warrior was like that, but he certainly was better than most. So this is one artist's version of what Crazy Horse might have looked like. It's a pretty cool image. He would paint hailstones on his body because he dreamt of the thunder and lightning. So he would use that. He would paint hailstone on his body. And he always wore, and there's only two things wrong with this sketch. He never wore an eagle feather. He always wore a hawk feather. Remember the hawk in his dream? No, he always wore a hawk feather, not an eagle feather. And he never wore it up. He always wore it down. And then the bridle on his horse, it's an iron bit. In this picture, it's iron and leather. He wouldn't have had that for his horse. He would have just had a simple jaw rope, like most Lakotas. Otherwise, this is a pretty accurate image of what he might have looked like. And he had some hard times too. He had a hard childhood because he was being teased and so forth. And then when he was a young man, he fell in love with a young woman named Black Buffalo Woman. And he wanted to marry, he courted her. He wanted to marry her. And he was getting a dowry ready. He was going to, give her family so many horses and so many other things because that was the custom. You weren't buying a wife, you were giving things valuable to replace her because you were taking her away from her family. So before he could do that, her father married her off to someone else. So, of course, broke his heart. Can you imagine? It wasn't easy. So he sort of got over it. He never forgot her. And but he moved on. He moved on. He had his family's help and advice, so he kind of put it behind him and he moved on until several years later, one black buffalo woman divorced her husband. That was allowed in those days. A woman could throw away her husband. And what she would do was take his belongings and throw them outside the lodge. Literally. And that was a message to him. You don't live here anymore. You're gone. You're out of my life. That's what she did. For whatever reason. But she had children with her husband, whose name was No Water. And then she ran away with Crazy Horse. And the husband couldn't let it go. The ex-husband couldn't let bygones be bygones. He chased them. He pursued them. He followed them for days, and he finally caught up with them. And when they weren't expecting it, he broke into the lodge, and he had a small caliber pistol, and he shot Crazy Horse. Happened to shoot him in the face, got him right here. And the bullet came out below his ear. Went in some corner of his mouth, went below his ear. So for the rest of his life after he healed, he had this scar right here. And he almost died. So in the interest of preserving peace in his village, and see, by now he was a leader. So he had to think about that. So in the interest of preserving peace, he let her go to go back to her husband. So he lost her twice. One, maybe I can handle. Twice, I don't know. So I mentioned he was a leader. So he became a leader because other people just naturally gravitated toward him because he was a good person. And he was sensible. And he was a reckless warrior. He was brave. His courage was almost legendary, even as a young man. But this is what enabled him to become a leader. The hierarchy that existed in Lakota society, and it started with the warriors and the warrior societies, and then the two kinds of leadership. There were the civilian leaders and there were the military leaders. A civilian leader would be like the mayor of a town. A military leader would be like the military, the generals and the captains and those kind of people. So there are those two kinds of leaders. And then above them were the medicine men who were very influential on the group who were ultimately responsible now as the old men for the village council, a gathering of old men. So this was a leadership hierarchy that Crazy Horse was a part of that enabled him, because it recognized his talents and his abilities and his achievements as a leader. And this is how he rose to leadership. This is what he did. He didn't intend to become a leader. He just did these things because it was part of his persona as a man and as a warrior. He distinguished himself in battle a lot. And because of all that, he developed a reputation for being sensible, for being cool under pressure. And people took notice of that. And he didn't want to be a leader. He wanted to be a warrior, like everybody else did. Every other male wanted to be a warrior. He wanted to be a fighting man. He didn't want to be a leader. People would ask him, "Oh, you should do that." No, I don't want the responsibility. And these were some contemporaries of Crazy Horse. Sitting Bull, you're familiar with. He was also a military and civilian leader, in addition to being a medicine man. This is Gall. If you've ever heard the name, he was Hunkpapa. He was one of Sitting Bull's people. Gall he had risen to leadership like Crazy Horse did. Gall was a very big man, really big, probably over 6'5". Very big, stalwart man. This is Spotted Tail. He was a Sicangu. His name was also Iron Wing. And he was related to Crazy Horse because it was probably his two sisters that the Crazy Horse's dad married. Probably, we don't know for sure. But those are some of his contemporaries that grew up sort of the same way, had some of the same values. There are all kinds of stories that sort of give an insight into what kind of a person Crazy Horse was. And after he became a leader, he took his people mainly up in what is now north central Wyoming, east of the Big Horn Mountains, really pretty country, for those of you who have been there. Really pretty country. So that's mostly where his people were. They would go up into what is now Montana to hunt and maybe over the mountains into Shoshone territory. But that was kind of where he kept his people. By then, some of the Lakota, most of the Lakota had surrendered and were living at Camp Robinson in Nebraska. Fort Robinson. They were first called Camp Robinson in the 1860s. And some of those young men kind of got bored with just living on agency, doing nothing, not being able to hunt, not being able to go to hunt. So some of them kind of broke away and they wanted to join Crazy Horse, a bunch of them. And he came to his village. And they told him that they had come to see him. So he met with them and he invited them to go on a rabbit hunt with him. To go and hunt rabbits. Not buffalo or not elk or not deer, rabbits. And so he did. He went hunting looking for rabbits, and some of the young men went with him. A few of them, not all of them. So they went hunting, they probably got some rabbits, and they came back to the village, and he talked to the young men that had gone hunting with him, and then he learned about them. He invited them to stay in his village. The others who said, "Nah, I don't hunting rabbits? Are you kidding? That's not a man's job." So those people who had that attitude, he wanted nothing to do with it. So what does that tell you about Crazy Horse? I think it's thinking that if you're willing to do anything for the people, then you're a good person. If you're going to turn your nose up at hunting rabbits to provide food, then I don't want you around. So that's an insight into the kind of person he was and the kind of leader he was. And as I said, by the 1860s, his reputation as a warrior and a leader was solidly established. And there was a battle that occurred in 1866 that really brought him to the forefront. And that's when his name first started to be spoken among the Washechus. And we'll go through this really fast. It's called the Battle of the 100 in Hand, or some people call it the Fetterman Battle or the Fetterman Massacre. It took place in northwest Wyoming, north of the town of Sheridan and Buffalo, Wyoming. And it was a really, really cold day, probably something like minus 30. Can you imagine? Being out in the open and riding a horse in a minus 30-degree temperature. Oh, man. So real quickly, this is where the battle took place. There's a fort called Phil Kearny. That's near where it happened. And there were 3 forts built along what we call the Bozeman Trail. But the middle fort was Fort Phil Kearny, and that's where they were a problem. They built a fort, and there were about 700 to 800 soldiers. And they were a thorn in the side of Lakota. They weren't supposed to be there. But the government had made a promise that if we're going to build anything, if we're going to capacity a country, we'll get your permission first. They didn't do that. They just moved in and built 3 forts. So the Lakota were trying to get them out of there. And that's why this battle occurred. And they tried several times to get soldiers to come out and engage them in a battle, but the soldiers wouldn't come out. So they didn't know what to do. So they, after observing the soldiers, they noticed that they would send a wagon, 3 or 4 wagons, west toward the mountains to gather wood, probably for their wood stoves. And so they waited and waited, and one day this group of soldiers came out, a group of civilians came out in wagons, and they were heading up into the mountains. So a designated group of warriors attacked the wagon train, the wagon detail. And meanwhile, Crazy Horse and his decoy warriors were waiting and hiding. And when the soldiers came out of the fort to rescue the wagon detail, then Crazy Horse attacked the soldiers. That's what started the battle. And as I said, Crazy Horse was selected because of his reputation. The elders selected him to be the leader of the decoys. So he picked 9 other guys. So the number of soldiers that came out to rescue the wood detail were 80. Actually, 78 soldiers and 2 civilians. So there were 80 people. So it was 10 against 80. Kind of overwhelming odds. So Crazy Horse and his warriors, to make a long story short, were able to lure these soldiers into an ambush 4.5 miles away on a day that was minus 30 degrees, riding a horse at a full gallop in that kind of weather, over icy slopes and across frozen streams. Can you imagine yourself doing that? Not me. I want to stay inside where it's nice and warm. But that's what happened. So here's the fort, Fort Kearney. And then the wagon detail came out. Oops, sorry. The wagon detail came out. It got attacked. Soldiers came out, and Crazy Horse attacked soldiers, and then made the soldiers follow them, lured them, did all kinds of things to keep the soldiers following him for 4.5 miles. And they would charge the soldiers and then ride away. And there were stories that even a couple of the warriors standing on the back of their horses as they were running. At one point, Crazy Horse even got off his horse and scraped the ice off the bottom of the horse's feet while the soldiers were shooting at him, just to keep the soldiers coming. And that's what they did. They lured them into this trap. Up here, there were 500 warriors, about 500 warriors waiting on either side of a deep draw. There were deep draws on either side. And at a given signal, those warriors came out and wiped out all the soldiers. So that was the Battle of the 100 in Hand. Why do we call it the 100 in Hand when there were only 80 men? It's because a mystic, a Cheyenne mystic, was asked how the battle was going to turn out. So he rode into the hills to pray and to seek a vision, and he came back and he said, I have a few soldiers in my hands. And he was told, no, that's not enough. So they sent him back in the hills again 2 or 3 times. And finally he came back and he said he was holding his arms like this. And he said, I have 100 soldiers in my hands. There'll be a victory today. So that's why the battle is called Battle of the 100 in Hand. Pretty close, 80 and 100, only off by 20. That's not bad. So that's really what established Crazy Horse's reputation solidly as a leader. And he was a shirt man. What the heck's a shirt man? Shirt man was a very unusual designation. And I'm putting this picture up there because this was purportedly a shirt that was given to him by the family of a friend of his named Little Big Man in the winter of 1876-77. And this is in some museum somewhere now. So this probably actually belonged to Crazy Horse. And because those were his colors, because he dreamt of the thunder and lightning, blue represents thunder and yellow represents lightning. So those were the colors on his shirt. And the shirt man was just basically a ceremonial position. Didn't come with any authority or power at all. The funny part about it was, if you wanted to be a shirt man, you were selected because of your reputation as a good person, as a possible leader, and you were asked to be a shirt man as a young man. And you were given a shirt to symbolize that status. Those shirts were elaborately made. They were made out of 4 bighorn sheep hides, one for the front, one for the back, one for each sleeve. And were all decorated with quills, later on with beads, and with hair. The women in the man's family would add locks of their hair to put onto that shirt. So that's what, it was called a shirt. It wasn't a war shirt. It's just a shirt. And that was a symbol of that office or that status. So each man who, wanted to be a shirt man was given a shirt. Crazy Horse didn't want to be a shirt man. He was asked, and he said, no, I don't want that responsibility. I don't want, because he was expected to live his life. All of them were expected to live their life as an example to everybody else. In other words, you had to live your life in the glass bowl, to do the right things, to be a good person all your life. Can you imagine having that responsibility? Not me. And I think Crazy Horse was sensible in turning it down. But his dad talked him into it. He said, people need you. People need you young men. So he agreed. So if you can imagine a gathering in a village, or several villages would come together, and there would be a good feast, and there would be dancing. But before it all started, the men, usually 4 at a time, would be placed at the center in the middle. And then there would be, the elders would come and talk to them, to be told of their responsibilities and what was expected of a shirt man. This is what was expected of a shirt man. This is what they had to live up to as a good person and as a leader. To wear the shirts, you must help others before you think of yourselves. Think about that. You must help the widows and those who have little to wear and to eat and no one to speak for them. You have to stand up for people. Stand up for those who don't have what everybody else does. Do not look down on others or look down on those, or see those who look down on you. Doesn't matter what anybody thinks or says about you, you have to ignore it. You have to be bigger than that. And do not let anger guide your mind or your heart. Don't do anything in anger. Be generous, be wise, and show fortitude. Here's the most important part. So that the people can follow what you do and then what you say. You have to go out and do it. You have to go out and perform it. You have to go out and actually achieve it. That way, then your words are going to carry weight. You can't just stand back and tell people what to do. You actually had to have done it yourself. So that's what a shirt man was expected to do. So you can see why Crazy Horse turned it down. He said, no, not me. I don't want that responsibility. But he reluctantly agreed to it. And then the last thing is, and above all, have courage and be the first to charge the enemy. Can you imagine that? Literally and figuratively. Be the first to charge the enemy. Be the first one to do it. Whatever it was. Not just charging the enemy, but doing something good, doing something right. Set the example for everybody else. Do it first. So these are the kind of things that Crazy Horse had to contend with as a leader. Remember the incident with Black Buffalo Woman? It happened after he was given the shirt. So because of that incident, some of the people felt he had to give back the shirt because he stained his reputation. So he gave it back. He gave it back to the elders. Said, I made a mistake. Here's your shirt. I'm no longer a shirt man. Did that matter to most people? No. Because he was still a good man. Still a good leader. Civilian or military. He was still a good man, still a good leader. So people still followed him. Didn't matter whether he gave up the shirt or not. That's how much people thought of him. And After a while, then his family encouraged him to marry, and then a family offered their daughter. So he married her. Her name was Blackshaw. However, after they had a daughter, she lived to be about 4 or 5 years old, and she died of cholera. So he had one tragic thing after another happened in his life. So he didn't have an easy life. There was a petroglyph. You know what a petroglyph is? As opposed to a pictograph, right? There was a petroglyph on a sandstone bluff above the Ash Creek, which flows into the Little Bighorn River in Montana, a few miles before it flows into the Little Bighorn River. One day, a Cheyenne friend of his named Stanton Timber, and he were riding around the camp, and they climbed up to this sandstone bluff. And Stanton Timber said, Crazy Horse carved this petroglyph, carved this image into the rock. And a lot of people say, well, that's Crazy Horse's signature, that he was saying, I was here. Not true. The snake was a symbol of enemies. And certainly the horse represents him. But what he was saying, that he knew he had enemies. Because either you liked him or you didn't. He had his supporters, but he also had his detractors. There are too many people who were jealous of him because he rose to leadership and achieved a status at a younger age than most people did. He was only 36 when he was killed. And most people reached the status of leadership, the level of leadership that he had not until they were 40s. So he was ahead of the curve a little bit. So this was simply him saying, I know I have leaders, and that's important to remember later on. And this was the only command, this was the only order he would ever give in battle. Mihakap hiupo, follow me. He never ever told anybody to go and do that. He always said this. Then he went and did it. So we'll go over these two incidents here. There are two battles that occurred, 8 days apart, one on June 17th, one on June 25th. And very important battles in annals of history. Tomorrow will be the 145th anniversary of the Greasy Grass fight, or the Battle of the Little Bighorn. 145 years ago, the June 25th battle happened. In early May, Sitting Bull had a vision, and his vision was literally, in his vision, soldiers falling from the sky with their horses, some with their ears cut off, falling into the circle of a Lakota camp. The first book I ever wrote, the title of it was Soldiers Falling at the Camp, and it was about the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And that was Sitting Bull's vision. And so the people were expecting that the soldiers were going to come and attack the village. And when, on June 16th, scouts came from the south and saw a column of soldiers coming, they were saying, well, it's Sitting Bull's vision trying to happen. Didn't turn out that way. They came to the village, which was still on Ash Creek, and reported to the elders about this big long column of soldiers of over 1,000 men. So Crazy Horse listened to that. He was the war leader. So he listened to that and he said, I will go and I will face the enemy. I will face these soldiers. Whoever wants to come with me can come. He didn't say you had to come, report to me at such and such an hour with your weapons. He didn't say that. He said, whoever wants to come with me. And he did this really cool thing. The village is really big, probably a quarter of a mile wide, if you can imagine that. Probably 7,000 people. And again, a whole bunch of horses. So he got on his horse, went to his lodge, got his horse and his war horse, got his weapons, and he rode around the village sunwise, clockwise, 4 times. And as he was going around, warriors joined him. And all those warriors circled the camp 4 times. If you can imagine that. Ended up at least maybe 500 or so warriors with their weapons, their lances, their bows and arrows, their shields, some of them leading a second horse, their war horse. And this happened at dusk. So when they finally, after the fourth turn and he rode south, it was dark. Night was coming. So they rode through the night, if you can imagine that, 50 miles to find those soldiers. And of course, it helped that some of them knew the country. But you can imagine, anybody here ever ride a horse at night without a flashlight, without headlights? Horses know the way. Horse will help get you there. So this is probably what they look like, And this is an artist's rendition of what those guys might look like. But if you can imagine, that staff has eagle feathers, and some only 2, some a lot. And each of those eagle feathers was earned in battle. So I wouldn't want to meet this guy in a dark alley. He'd kick my ass. That's the kind of warriors they were. So you can imagine 500 of those guys. And they rode through the night. Couldn't have been easy, not by any stretch. So to sum it up, they were found, when they got there, the Crow Scouts found them, the battle ensued. They fought all day over this hilly area north of where the town of Sheridan, Wyoming is, and well into the afternoon. They were outnumbered. This was Crook's column, and he had 1,300 men, 1,000 soldiers and 300 Shoshone and Crow Scouts. So they were outnumbered 2-1. But the battle was a draw. Crook suffered between 60 and 100 killed and wounded, and there were a lot of wounded for the Cheyenne and the Lakota, but only 10 killed. So when the soldiers couldn't pursue them anymore, they just left. And again, they rode back through the night. And by the time they got home, it was in the morning again. So that was, to make it short, the Battle of Rosebud. That's important. That happened on June 17th, 8 days later. And this is what happened. Battle of Little Bighorn took place there, about 50 miles apart. About the 22nd after that, they moved the village further down the creek, along Ash Creek, and then went into the Greasy Grass Valley and made this encampment on the east side of the Greasy Grass River. And by now, the encampment was at least 8,000 people, maybe 10,000 people. And you can imagine the number of horses, somewhere around 12,000 to 15,000 head of horses. And the reason they were moving the camp, because the horses were eating all the grass down. Wherever they go, the horses would graze all the grass down. So they had to keep moving to find forage for the horses. So that's why they moved. And they put up their village in this big old growth of cottonwood trees along the river. So you couldn't see it from a distance. But by then, soldiers were like about 15 miles away on a butte, and they managed to see the horses. They couldn't see the village, but they saw the horses through about a 25-power telescope. And to them, the horse herd looked like worms in the grass, maggots in the grass. The herd was so thick. That's all they could see at the distance. And interesting enough, this was Custer's regiment, Custer's men. And those scouts were telling him, don't go there. There's a lot of people there. They'll kick your ass if you go there. Of course, he didn't listen. So the Battle of the Little Bighorn happened over 2 days. It wasn't just one event. It happened over 2 days with 3 engagements. The first started when Reno attacked the southern end of the camp with 120 men. He was stopped, and they made him retreat. They chased him back across the river. That's the first engagement. Second engagement happened when Custer himself tried to go around and attack what he thought was the northern end of the encampment. But it was only the middle, because the camp stretched for 2 miles. It was bigger than he thought. But he was stopped at the crossing. But overall, there were about 650 or so soldiers. Almost half of them were killed. And that, in a nutshell, was the battle. Crook was supposed to have been part of that. But when Custer was dying on the Little Bighorn, Crook and his men were hunting and fishing in the Bighorn Mountains. They were having a good time. And you know what the strange thing is? Nobody ever took him to task about it. Nobody ever said, well, why did you do that? Under any other circumstances, somebody else would be accused of dereliction of duty or desertion or something, but not Crook. And this is sort of a map that indicates what it looked like, where the camps might have been. But as I said, the camp was about 2 miles long. And then to the west, there's a big wide flat floodplain. That's where the horses were. That's where the horses were. Good grass, that's where they were. So again, getting back to Crazy Horse, here's where I think some of his values were. Courage, compassion, humility, certainly, and generosity. He was a very humble person. By the time he was in his mid-20s, he had earned more battle honors than most men did in their whole lives. But he never bragged about it. Not one time. He didn't wear feathers in his hair like most warriors did. He didn't. He always dressed plainly, very plain clothes. And he always walked around with his head down and was always respectful to people. And here's what I think some of his character traits were. He was very determined. He was very cool under fire. Very cool. You keep it together. Keep us cool. And he was very loyal. He never left anybody dead or alive, dead or wounded on the field of battle. He always brought all his warriors home, no matter what the situation. And of course, he was very humble. In May of 1877, after the Little Bighorn, his Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull were the only two still out living the wild and free life. But they're having a hard time. The buffalo were gone by now. And ammunition was hard to find because they had to trade for it or buy it. And they had all kinds of different kinds of guns. So it was hard for them to get bullets for their guns to hunt or defend themselves. And his village was attacked a couple times. So given all this information, he took it to his elders and they decided, well, maybe we better think about giving in to the whites and going to Fort Robinson. It wasn't something nobody wanted to do. Nobody wanted to do that, least of all Crazy Horse. But they had to think of the women and children and the old people. Who's going to protect the women and the children and old people if we all die fighting? So they went and left for Fort Robinson. It was during that trip from north central Wyoming to Nebraska, about the distance of about 300 miles, that the little big man family made that shirt and gave it to Crazy Horse. That I showed you earlier. So he had only less than 1,000 people. And about 128 of those were fighting men. So you can imagine the rest of them were women and children and old folks. So there was a lot of responsibility riding on his shoulders. And when they got to the fort, but all along the way they talked about it, what you would do. Most of the warriors didn't want to give up, but they understood why they were going. When arriving at Fort Robinson, some of the warriors changed their mind. Once they saw the white people, once they saw the soldiers, they changed their mind. Oh, we can take these guys. Let's fight them. We can get them. We can kill them all and free everybody. But Crazy Horse and his elders knew that even if they were victorious in attacking the soldiers at Fort Robinson, there would be retaliation from the white folks later on. And the white people would come after them. So, in order to avoid any incident, Crazy Horse surrendered his gun and his horse to an army officer. Those are the very symbols of being a warrior, to surrender your gun and your horse, to give it to somebody he hated with a passion, a white person. That had to have been the hardest thing he probably ever did in his life. But he did it to protect everybody else, to avoid bloodshed. He was living up to his responsibility and his code as a leader and as a shirt man. So, remember the dream? So the writer, the interpretation of the dream by the medicine man was this. The writer would be harmed or betrayed by his own people. Because remember, as I said, the people that came up out of the ground, formed out of the ground, were brown skinned and looked like the rider, his own people. They surrounded him and they pulled him down from his horse. And the rider would die young. That was the interpretation. When Crazy Horse got to Fort Robinson, the Lakota leaders who were already there, who had been appointed by the army to be chiefs, were jealous of Crazy Horse. They were afraid that he would be appointed chief over them. They were jealous of him anyway because of his reputation. Some of them didn't like him. So all this started when he got there. All these rumors and all this innuendo and all this jealousy came up. And then to top it off, the white people didn't trust Crazy Horse. After all, he's the one that kicked Custer's ass. So they were afraid of him. So on one hand, some of his own people were jealous of him, and on the other hand, the white guys were afraid of him. That doesn't mean anything good. So all these rumors were flying around. And to top it off, in the middle of it all, the Nez Perce were trying to escape from the army way up in the northwest. And the army came recruiting for scouts, and they came to Fort Robinson and wanted Crazy Horse to lead a bunch of scouts. And so Crazy Horse went to his elders and asked what to do, and his elders said, no, just leave those people alone. They're trying to be free. They're trying to live like we are. We're trying to be free of these whites. So Crazy Horse turned down the army. He said, no, I don't want to do that. So, of course, that made the army even more suspicious of him. So they decided to arrest him and put him in jail, probably send him away to Florida, because a lot of notable Indian leaders had been sent to Florida. Geronimo was sent to Florida. So Crazy Horse was one of those they were going to send to Florida. So they sent a contingent of Indian police, Indian guys who were working for the army, to go and apprehend him and bring him back to the fort. So when they got him back to the fort, they told him he was going to talk to the commander of the fort, but it didn't turn out that way. They were taking him to a jail instead, to a stockade. And if you've ever been at Fort Robinson, a replica of that stockade is still there. And there's a stone monument right where Crazy Horse fell because he got into a fight. He tried to get away. Once he realized that they were going to put him in jail, he put up a resistance. The only weapon he had was a knife under his blanket. And he tried to fight his way out. And then a soldier heard what was going on, came around the building, and he had a bayonet on the end of his rifle that was about that long, 18 inches long. And then, man, Crazy Horse is a slender guy. So while his arms are being held, the soldiers thrust his bayonet and got him from one side to the other, through both his kidneys. And he fell right there, mortally wounded. So when they realized what had happened, they carried him to the infirmary across the way. And he lingered there all evening and into the night until he died later that night. So his dream came true. His own kind betrayed him. But if he believed the dream, the interpretation, that he was going to die young, anytime he rode into battle, he probably thought, well, this is going to be my last day on earth, so I'm going to let it all hang out. I'm going to go out fighting like a man. So that's why he was so reckless in battle. Unfortunately, he didn't die in battle. He died fighting, but not in battle. So that, folks, is the life of Crazy Horse. Very to me, an inspirational story. He's one of my heroes. Has been since the first time I heard stories about him. So if you have any questions, I'll be glad to entertain any questions. That doesn't mean I know anything, but you sure can ask questions.